Omuuonge Uozombuze.
Amaba hoasa.
So we sought the expertise of the Media Monitoring Africa, through which I first interacted with Mr. William Baird. In that meeting, it was quite fascinating how Mr. Baird's organization was using innovations to fight disinformation, which in the end results in citizens getting access to credible news. But who is Mr. Baird? So William Baird studied at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where he obtained his BA and honors degree in drama and film. He worked in television after completing his studies. Unable to resist the law of media monitoring, which was really his interest, William started with some part-time monitoring for the Media Monitoring Project, now which is called the Media Monitoring Africa, MMA, in 1995. And after leaving television, he joined the MMA as a researcher. At the Media Monitoring Africa, William has overseen or been directly involved in over 100 media monitoring projects on subjects ranging from gender-based violence, HIV, and racism to children and the media. William has also completed overseeing the data analysis of the biggest civil society media monitoring exercise in the world, the Global Media Monitoring Project. For this project, over 100 countries monitored gender around the world, and William has also overseen the name change of the MMP to Media Monitoring Africa in 2008. William was appointed an Ashoka Fellow in 2009 and also a Link Fellow in 2010 for his work on children's participation in the media. And you can imagine how most often we leave out children as sources of news in our coverage. He's regularly accessed in the media on a range of media-focused issues. And in his 12 years as director of MMA, William has helped his organization grow from a small 3-people-driven organization to a committed team of 16 people with a clear vision and a dedicated program areas. William's knowledge of media monitoring and commitment to deepening democracy in South Africa and the continent has ensured his expertise is internationally recognized. And this is why I think, colleagues, you would agree with me that Mr. Baird is the best suited person to speak on using quality journalism to fight disinformation. Mr. Baird, your time.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you for that rather long and embarrassing recollection of a brief potted history. It's really very exciting to be at this very cool conference, and I'm loving the way that you are incorporating so many different elements. So congratulations to the organizers that you've got a WhatsApp group going, and then the chat. And I'm seeing although my eyes aren't that good to see what your other colleagues doing in the back with the drawings, but I think that'll be there. So that's very cool. So thank you very much for being here. And it was really most exciting to be able to have some role, and hopefully we can expand that in the new year to continue that work around combating disinformation. So I'm going to just share my screen because I do have a presentation, which I apologize for not having sent to the organizers before. I will send it immediately after my session. But I have been asked to speak on the role of media in terms in combating disinformation and sometimes called fake news. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but and my suggestions of what we might need in the journalism and education field. But of course, my expertise doesn't really lie there, and there are some superb experts already on this event who I think would be able to and have been making some excellent comments and suggestions in that regard. So I think that before I begin, I want to just outline some of the core assumptions that are really important to think about as we go down this rabbit hole, which is that journalism matters. Sometimes we forget this in the hullabaloo of things and in the regular and frequent attacks. And I noticed that our orange-haired lunatic, who still happens to be the president of the USA, has already featured. You know, in the ongoing attacks against journalism, we forget just how important it is and how much a difference it does make on a regular and ongoing basis. And we also forget that journalism has enormous power, despite all of these massive shifts that have occurred over the last couple of years and will continue to shift how everything operates. It's really, really important that we hold on to that, because this is actually journalism is a noble cause. And I know that generally it's got a bit of a negative reputation, certainly among politicians and the dirty in societies. But it really is a noble profession, actually, and we need to make sure that we remember that. So one of the themes that I'll keep returning to is journalism as a public good. Journalism's no longer this idea that it's just exposing the watchdogs, etc., which isn't to say that it doesn't have enormous problems, and it isn't to say that there aren't scumbags who are journalists. Of course there are. We have some of those in our own country, you know, we have them all over the world. But it is to say that journalism itself now, particularly in our new digital existence, is even more important, and it has an even greater role to play. So I'm just going back to the basic of this idea of how digital media has changed everything. You know, this idea that it isn't. You know, there's some presidents and figures in authority on our continent who seem to think that they can hide away from this. They've been trying to regulate it dramatically. They're trying to hide it away. They talk about it as this modern evil kind of thing. You know, that's just out of touch with reality. And those people are really going to find themselves ultimately redundant. Is it has changed everything, and it's done that in a number of ways. It's challenged power, and in so doing, it's created new focal points of power. So I use that diagram up there because it used to be that your centers, your loci of power were quite clearly determined, right? In the old days, very old days, it used to be the church and then the state, and then the church and the state and various others. And as the media evolved and developed, the media itself became a very key center of power for maintaining, reinforcing the dominant narratives, reinforcing people in power. The media has, for example, been used for centuries on our continent to help enforce colonial attitudes and colonialism directly, right? It played a fundamental role in enforcing apartheid theory in South Africa as an example. So it's been there, and so it's not necessarily always been a force for good. In fact, frequently it maintains the dominant that is there. Whether or not those people are good or not doesn't impact that necessarily. So the key thing is that what digital has done is it's now put up any other number of centers of power that have challenged and shifted that, right? And so some of them, like these new social media platforms like Facebook and stuff, I mean, they're more powerful than most governments around the world. Certainly their earnings, you know, they make more than the GDP of many nations on our continent. So the consequences of these shifts in power is that it's turned our world upside down, and it continues to turn it upside down, hence the little whirly graphic. And that we see this enormous power that is being vested in these platforms. So, and you've now got a completely new player in terms of power dynamics. It's no longer just the state and the media and other sources. It's now this new thing that is basically a global conglomerate and behemoth that has power. And the thing for us down here on our continent is that, broadly speaking, we don't really feature, you know, because their power is where they reside. It's where they live. It's like media, you know, they live in California, and they live in places that are completely removed from where we are on our continent. And again, that has a very particular set of impacts on how we are going to deal with the threats that these things pose. So at the same time as those things have enormous power, we also see that it's actually become a lot easier to challenge power, right? Because if you want to get something out on social media now, one of the biggest shifts, of course, and initially we thought it was very nice and democratizing, but of course, unless you make it democratic, it's going to only serve to reinforce existing inequalities, but that's a separate argument. But for the moment, though, the key thing is it's become a lot easier to challenge power. All you need now, you no longer need a broadcaster and millions of dollars of infrastructure and signal distribution networks and. All you need is a device a bit like this, and you've got just about everything you need in your hand, you know, and a little bit of resources. It's not like no resources, but with comparatively few resources, you can actually challenge power in ways that are extraordinary. And that's powerful, and it's a disaster, because in as much as it's easy to spread journalism, and we've seen how some of our media have taken like ducks to water to really use digital to improve things and make things a lot better, we've also know that it's also then made it that much easier to spread disinformation. Now, disinformation isn't new, right? But what is new is the ease with which it can be created and spread. And it's getting easier all the time. And it's getting more and more convincing, depending on where it's coming from all the time. The other thing that I've got there in red is that, excuse me, is that disinformation destroys democracy. It's not just bad. It's not just bad for journalism. It's not bad just for civil society or for those groups that are targeted. It fundamentally undermines the democratic fabric of any potential nation. So the tyrants and the fools and the idiots that think that they can use it in order to pursue their agenda, they may win in the short term some easy victories, but in the long term they will lose, because ultimately it will rob them of that own power, because it just as much as they can use it for their own favor currently, as soon as power shifts, you can get someone else who can use that same force against them with equal destructive capabilities in the near future. So it's a very fundamentally destabilizing, destructive force that puts the public, and one of the dangers of disinformation is, of course, the public as the ultimate targets to a large degree of disinformation, is that it puts them in a place where they don't know. And that is the exact antithesis of what journalism does, right? Journalism, good journalism, puts you in a position where you know more. You are informed, you're able to think through things, you know what is going on, or you have a sense of what's going on, and you can find your way through and make your own decision as to how to act in society, right? It empowers you to act and to do things and make informed decisions, and therefore choose who you would like to vote for in an election period, for example. Disinformation robs you of that. What it does is it puts you in a place where you no longer know. That orange-haired lunatic who I've got on the screen at the moment keeps making us think that we don't know what's going on. Why? Because he keeps denying that he's lost the elections. He keeps asserting as fact that he hasn't lost, you know. And when you get someone in that position of power who repeatedly does that, it undermines everything that we know. It undermines the electoral process in the states, and it undermines democracy generally, right? So it's not like he's just doing damage to the USA. He's doing damage to democratic and democracies around the world for the way that he's responding to this particular crisis of disinformation. The other bad news, because of course there's worse news, I mean, aside from everything that's going wrong and COVID and stuff, which I'll broadly try to avoid here, is that this has come at about the worst time ever for journalism, right? We know this, and our speakers have before have spoken to many of these issues. There's a crisis of sustainability for the majority of media. We've got fewer journalists and there are fewer public media. And I emphasize public media. We've got a crisis around our public broadcasters, most of them state broadcasters on our continent. That's a disaster for trying to combat disinformation. And it's a disaster for trying to build quality journalism. Because if you look at the studies around research, sadly, most of them are based in the North, the ones that have the highest levels of trust are the public broadcasters around in countries where they are operating independently and producing quality news and information. And we know from this recent COVID period that in a crisis, that's what people look for. So you've got this thing of this brand new set that challenges power, these new locus of power, and you've got a whole range of actors who with a few $1,000s can do huge amount of damage. And at the same time, the people that are the bulwark, the first line of defense, the journalists and our media and our journalism sector, are having their backsides kicked from here to to the USA, you know, and it's on just about every parameter. If it isn't their sustainability, it's our governments on our continent who more frequently than not are keep arresting our journalists. You know, we just north of our border, you do your job as a journalist, you get arrested. That doesn't help anything. That undermines everything in the basic democracy, right? They've got to stop that nonsense. So we also know that the skills now are vitally more important now than almost ever before. And not just because they are there to hold the powerful to account, which is, you know, the media is a traditional role and how they've traditionally been trained, but because they've got to help us understand what's credible. They've got to fight through the never-ending swathes of information and say, these are the things that we know to be credible and accurate and evidence-based, and these are the things that are not, and here's the things that we know how to deal with, etc., right? So journalism's role now is not just about exposure. It's not just about the investigative journalism. It's fundamentally about helping people understand our world, right? And it's a fairly subtle but a very, very vital shift that we need to think about. So if we talk about journalism and education particularly, there's a key need, I think, for, and some of our institutions are addressing this, I know, but I think that what we're seeing certainly in some of the sectors that we work with and the journalists that we work with in South Africa and around the region is that our journalists need social media skills, and they need to know how to manage their digital footprint, right? So you can get excellent, astonishingly good investigative journalists who, frankly, with digital media, they are, you know, a 10-year-old, an average 10-year-old is going to be better skilled than they are. And that's, you know, the nature of how these things are. But we need to, if we're looking at producing better quality journalists, we need to make sure that they have the necessary digital skills. Why? Because that's where everything's going. Whether they like it or not, it's all going to be digital, right? The next skill that they need is and that's managing their digital footprint. It's so that people know who they are, how they work, etc., what their core assumptions are, all of these things around starting to build trust and credibility. They also need to know how to manage attacks. And these attacks, particularly online, because of course that's one of the more common methods now. You just get a gang of people online who'll go after a journalist. There's obviously a gender dimension to that, and we need to make sure that our journalism institutions are responding to that. We need to give our journalists the tools to deal with, you know, things where they just say, "Oh, you're a rubbish journalist," which is, you know, water off a duck's back, to things that are far more concerning, where they threaten physical threats, or they, you know, threats of rape, etc., The next thing that they need is that they, in addition to that, they need additional digital media skill sets. So they need to skill sets of digital sleuthing these days, which is becoming increasingly popular. Looking at content, being able to understand it, determine where it's from, what it looks like. How do they know that this is accurate or reliable? Because they know that increasingly they're the targets of disinformation. They need to know what to look for, and they need to know how to manage that and deal with it. They also need manipulating and managing data. This is, you know, the new world. What do they say? That data is the new oil. This is very true, particularly for journalism. There's so much out there now. It is on many levels about being able to harness, make sense, and present that data in ways that is more understandable to your average member of the public and your audience. So those data skills, which used to be the you know, the area of the geeks and a few little nerds, now this is becoming a vital and essential skill for any future and competent journalist. Then one that I know, I think I saw him earlier on the call, Professor Franz Kruger is excited about, is of course ethics, and he's right to be going on about this, as he has been for the last 2 decades, if not more, precisely because this is the thing ultimately that starts to determine the difference between someone who says, "Oh, I'm a journalist," and someone who actually is a journalist, and the way that they operate, the principles that they accept and that they adhere to in the way that they practice their craft, right? Ethics, ethics, ethics. We can't you know, underestimate the importance of this. Sadly, far too often it's given short shrift in many of the training issues, and this is a skill that is not something you can just learn in a half-day workshop. Ethics is about practice. It's about an approach, a way of thought, and thinking through things with people and thinking through and making correct ethical decisions that you critically you can stand by, support, and justify to the people that you need to. And then the last skill that I think we need our journalists to think about is journalism as a public good, right? We need to shift this idea that they are mavericks alone operating in this crazy world. Yes, they are to a degree, but they're also people that are part of society. We increasingly, this idea that they're separate from, we need to see them as part of us, part of our society, part of this thing of a public good, you know, that this is, that they have a critical, that they're an integral role of our society. They don't sit outside there as some kind of independent fourth estate. They're part and parcel of us and of our society. And that's, as part of that, they, you know, as essential as roads, water, electricity. So how do we combat this disinformation? Well, the traditional wisdom says we do it through quality journalism, which of course is correct. It is certainly one of the most effective and powerful tools to combat disinformation. So if we think about journalism as a public good, you've got this idea of, on the one side, we're saying journalism is far more than just a watchdog, right? This idea that they're there to hold the powerful to account and show off things, bad things when they happen, expose corruption, critical to democracy, yes. But as I've said, their emerging role is to help mediate, sift the credible from the crap, right? That role is something that is no longer just a nice to have. You know, it's not a nice to have. Thank you for exposing the corrupt. They are as essential to a democratic state as having a functioning judiciary, a functioning parliament, a functioning executive, right? That's how important they are. And seeing that as a public good is a really critical thing when we're wanting to combat disinformation. Then as the lines become more blurred, we know that the adherence to ethical principles and principles of transparency and accountability are even ever more important. So that, you know, it's not good enough just to do good journalism. If you're going to, you have to make sure that you adhere to these principles as well. Why? Because you've got clowns and idiots and evil people out there all the time who say, I'm a journalist, and they publish the biggest load of nonsense you could ever hope to imagine. And they say, I'm a journalist. And then what they do in doing that is they equate those people that speak utter nonsense with really good quality, thoughtful journalists, right? So you've got to make sure that we draw those distinctions for the public, not so much for the journalists, but for the public, because each slip up undermines all journalism, right? And we've seen this time and time again in South Africa. You know, whenever a reputable or credible media entity makes some kind of egregious error, it doesn't just undermine their credibility, because those that don't like the media use it to attack all media, right? That's what Donald Trump does. Whenever he sees any media that makes some kind of a error, he goes, you see, it's all fake news, it's all this, right? He uses it deliberately to undermine all media. So at the same time, remembering journalism has huge power to deepen democracy. But journalism is not enough, right? There's not enough any longer to combat the dark forces, right? If you look at this, if it was enough, this complete raving lunatic, and I think it's not a stretch to say he's a raving lunatic, despite the position that he holds. He's, you know, various media in the States have counted the number of lies. This meme that I found last night, over 10,000, right? They literally count the number of times he lies. So if doing quality journalism was enough to combat disinformation, then we would have no problem, right? And what this demonstrates is that clearly it isn't enough, right? And that goes back to the point that I'm saying, that journalism is a public good. It's one of the key elements that we have to use and embrace if we're going to stand any real chance of defeating this. And defeat this we must. Why? Because if we don't, it's the end of democracy, literally, right? That black hole there is not an exaggeration. So we need all entities to play their part. Critical, quality journalism, yes, 1,000 times yes. Celebrate, commend, support, do whatever we can to support it. But we also need the state to play their role. They've got to stop these neo-colonial repressive tactics that we continuously see in our region. You know, this idea that you know, you can have these big puffed up old men who think that they can run and determine everything. Folks, you're out of touch with reality. You're out of touch with your continent and your people. It's not going to work anymore. Deal with it, right? We've got to make sure that states play their part. It's not to say they don't have a part, because of course they do. They have a very, very important part. The third element is platforms have to take meaningful action. This idea that yes, they're there and they care a lot and whatever, and we see them sometimes appear before the US Senate and all these kinds of things, you know, they're not going to come and represent down here, are they? Honestly, can you imagine Mark Zuckerberg coming to the parliament in Malawi and saying, I'm very sorry about these things and this is what we're going to do? Right? We're laughing because no. So we need them to play a meaningful part and take meaningful actions. Not to say they haven't done things, because they have, but they equally need to play a meaningful part. And the fourth element is around the public and civil society, and they need to be empowered. Because again, this idea of media is a little island that they determine the thing, they set the narrative, they do this. No. Old, out-fashioned, it's gone, it's out of touch with reality. Public are part and parcel of that. Without the public, without your audience, you don't have the media, right? And for far too often, that link has not been there. It's just been this thing that they speak down to them or speak to them and not with them. We have to be talking about empowering our public and civil society. So institutions like MISA Malawi, massively important, right? Critical role in society, and similarly in the region. Just said that because, you know, I think they're great, and obviously I'm a little bit biased, but anyway. Next slide, please, William. Okay, so we need empowered public and civil society. And part of that is about digital literacy. And I don't mean how to use a computer. I mean proper digital literacy skills, the ability to spot and sift the crap from the credible, right? If you don't have our public helping the media in that job, we're on a hiding to nothing, right? So digital literacy skills for all of the members of the public is as important, because they're learning this. How do we know that this is important? I'll give you a simple example, because when you go and drive a car in any of our countries, you don't just jump in and drive. Well, I mean, you might, but you'll probably be arrested. But if you drive a car, you have to get a driver's license. Why? Because they're rules of the road. Why? Because you need to know them in order how to navigate and make sure you prevent and limit the potential for harm. It's exactly the same thing with the internet. You have to have people having empowered digital literacy skills. Why? Because if you don't, you keep putting them in charge, or in the power of a loaded nuclear missile effectively in their hands, and not giving them guidance and skills to navigate that and determine that, right? And government's power over this area is no longer what it used to be. It used to be very nice and easy for them to control these things, not anymore. At the same time, you don't just need to give them those skills, you need to give them the ability to act. This is equally important in our view. Why? Because what disinformation does, as I've said before, is it undermines your ability. You think, gosh, do vaccines work? Don't they work? Well, there's these people that say they do, and there are these people that say they've made of baby fetuses and that they've got microchips in them. And all you have to get to that point is that you no longer know what to do. And the moment you're in that position, what do? You go, well, I don't know what to do. I can't act. You're unable to act in your society. So here's part of our answer. This is the tool that Teresa was mentioning that we did with MISA, we've done in South Africa, and we're still running here around COVID. And I've got a little short video. Let me just check how I'm doing for time. Actually, I need to wrap it up. So actually, I'm not going to show this video now, but it is there in the presentation. And what we've built with Real 411 is a tool where effectively it's a public complaints platform. In other words, if you see something that you think is dodgy on the internet, on a digital platform, you can report it to the platform. It gets assessed by a range of experts, and I'm very happy to go into detail as to how it works. And then a finding is made, and then action can be taken. That action can be that we ask the platform to take that down. We can issue a counter narrative, and we can watch how these things go, and we can help identify some of the people involved in these things. So what this does, it's linked to the previous point, is that it says there's no longer nothing that you can do. There's something that you can start to do. If you start to think about these things every time you consume content on digital media and you think, well, hang on a minute, is this dodgy? How do I know? What are the things that I don't know? And if I think it's dodgy, I want to report it somewhere. So you don't only critically assess it, you have the power and the means and the ability to engage with that content, and that you can send it to people, and that something can be done about that. Now, the reason this matters as an independent entity is that this is built on our continent entirely. It's built within our laws and our frameworks and our issues, and it assesses the same content regardless of platform. Because at the moment, you'll see there's this crazy thing where there's that lunatic Steve Bannon who called for the beheading of Fauci in the States. And that content was removed from Twitter, but the exact same content was kept on Facebook. Now, how do you have that in a society where you're trying to get some semblance of what is and what we will tolerate and what we won't tolerate, right? Again, this is our continent. These are our issues, our laws. We need to be able to determine these things. Sending them off to a place where we don't know where they go, we don't know on what basis they're reviewed, and there's no appeals mechanism, to me, doesn't seem to be enforcing and deepening democracy. This is a tool that allows us to do that. It helps with digital literacy, and critically, it empowers the public. So I see it's starting to flag now. Sorry, thing. Let me just move on. So the conclusion is that we have to have quality journalism. The role and that the people on this call, the experts here, they need to take a rest now at the end of the year. They need to look after themselves. They need to be well fed. They must make sure that they rest their brains, that they read nice books and think things. They need to be well rested, because their role in our coming years is absolutely vital. They are our treasures to help build and develop our journalists. But we also need journalists who are given on-the-job skills to contribute. And critically, we need to be bringing the different stakeholders together. We need an empowered public, accountable platforms, engaged states that puts the public interest first if we're to meaningfully combat disinformation.
Omuuonge Uozombuze.
Amaba.